So I have this unfortunate, unique ability to embarrass myself fairly often by calling people by the wrong name. And sometimes it's totally innocent. Some of you probably have been the victim of this, but sometimes like it's just innocent. Sometimes it's because I'm getting older and it's hard for me to remember names, and sometimes it's just that I confuse a person for someone else that I'm thinking of. A couple examples. Most recently, I had a friend of mine tell me that about another friend of mine who was telling me about his name, and I thought that he was telling me about a totally different guy. And so for the last 3 months, I've been calling this guy by the wrong name. And for whatever reason, he wasn't telling me that I was calling him by the wrong name. And so you guys can see that I felt like an absolute idiot, not to mention how that obviously makes somebody feel when you're calling them by the wrong name, makes them feel as if they're really insignificant, right? And by the way, I've been a victim of this. Unfortunately, I've grown up with the last name Chilton, and I've literally had everything under the sun named or sent. Like I'll get mail and it'll be Roger Clifton, Roger Shelton, Roger. I've literally had somebody say Chitlin before. And so, and I mean, and when I get it, I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm paying bills. You don't have a problem with my money. You just got a problem with my name, right? Like, you think at some point somebody would get that right. Even worse, though, one time I was new as a minister, and I was marrying some friends of mine, and so I had prepared the script, the ceremonial script for the wedding the night before to reflect the right names of the individuals that I was marrying. But as you go through, you can just kind of replace the name, right? And I missed one spot, so that during the ceremony with a crowd of people, I literally called the bride by the name of the bride I had married previously. So you can imagine, it was really awkward. All I remember was saying, "Will you take so and so to be your wife?" And the groom saying, "No." But I wasn't looking up. I was looking down. I was doing my job. You know what I mean? It was important to me. And I remember saying that. And all of a sudden, I remember him saying no. And I went to keep going. And I was like, wait a minute. What did he say? And I looked up and I realized, oh my gosh, like I just called her by the wrong name. Needless to say, I've yet to been able to live that down, and rightfully so, considering the magnitude of that day being a day to remember forever, right? And so now they remind me of this all the time, right? And while I'm sure y'all enjoy having a good laugh at my expense, I bring this up because this is what the modern day church does with the word God. Here's what I mean. God is not a name, it's a title. God is not a name, it's a title. It would be like president or captain or sergeant or whatever. It's not a name, it's a title. But God is the English word that we use when we're referring to a supreme being with supernatural powers that we know we don't possess, right? And so to say, I love God in our culture doesn't mean the same thing it did during the Bible times. And that's what we're going to see today. Today, we throw God around as if we all know who we mean, but we know that there are so many variations of gods and various beliefs about God. It's really hard to know what anybody's referring to when they say anything about God these days. So, what y'all need to understand as the church, we believe that there is one true God, capital G, which historically for America has been the Judeo Christian God. That is the God of the Bible, the God that the Jews, the Hebrews believed in, and the God that the Christians believe to be the one true God, which means that makes us monotheistic. Mono being one, theistic being God. We believe in one single God or spiritual being who is the creator and sustainer of all things, who makes himself known so that we can know him, who has no rivals, who is all powerful, who's all knowing and always present, who's infinite, eternal, and unchangeable, who has a name. So that to only call him God is to call him by the wrong name. Therefore, you very well could have the wrong person. You very well could mean the wrong thing. And because your eternal destiny relies on this, you too may never live it down, because you'll be reminded forever by the separation from the presence of God. Now, to be fair, it's human to get someone's name wrong, right? Although it's embarrassing, it's humiliating, and it can be hurtful to the person you are calling the wrong name. But to get God's name wrong means you have the wrong God. So this morning, what we're going to learn is God's name and the significance to how that affects our life, how the implications of that apply to our lives. And so we're going to be back in Exodus chapter 3. I'll read to you and it'll be on the screen. Verse 13. Then Moses asked God, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? God replied to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I am to be remembered in every generation. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me and said, I've paid close attention to you and to what has been done to you in Egypt, and I have promised you that I'll bring you up from the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivitites, and the Jebusites. A mouthful. A land flowing with milk and honey. They will listen to what you say. Then you, along with the elders of Israel, must go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Now, please let us go on a 3-day trip into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. However, I know that the king of Egypt will not allow you to go, even under force from a strong hand. But when I stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles that I will perform in it, after that, he will let you go. And I'll give these people such favor with the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. Each woman will ask her neighbor and any woman staying in her house for silver and gold jewelry and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and daughters so that you will plunder the Egyptians. This is the word of the Lord. Amen. Thanks be to God. Now, what I hope to do this morning is help you all with two things, specifically the two things that we learn here, who God is, and by being in a relationship with him, who that makes us. And so that song that we just sang, I know who I am because I know who you are, right? which we captured a glimpse of last week in the beginning of the back and forth, the negotiation or the dialogue between Moses and God. And so we're going to lean back quickly into verses 11 and 12 and read those. It says, "But Moses asked God, 'Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt?' He answered, 'I'll certainly be with you, and this will be the,'" he doesn't answer Moses' question. He doesn't say, "Well, this is who you are." He says, "I will certainly be with you, and this will be the sign to you that I'm the one who sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will all worship God at this mountain." Now, the first 10 verses, we learned last week that God had gave Moses the motive for intervening in his life, and that was that God had saw and heard his people, and he was compassionate and he loved them. And then he shared the purpose of the intervention, being that God was going to rescue his people from the oppression. And then he tells Moses the plan, which was God was going to use Moses to do this. Moses, rightfully so, says, "Well, who am I to go do something like this?" Right now, I want you to pay attention to something here, because if you remember last week, Moses, bless his heart, he's minding his own business. He's working his 410s, doing a sheep herding gig, and the living God interrupts him to do an intervention on him. And he says, "Well, who am I to do this?" And so as he's busy doing all these things, he begins to ask questions. Moses starts asking questions. Now, I want to say this because oftentimes I've thought of this as a great illustration in what we do in response to God moving in our lives, because everything God tells Moses, it seems like he comes up with excuses for, right? But this past week, I've thought a lot about the questions that he was asking, and what I come to a conclusion on is these questions were necessary to motivate him to obey God. See, when we ask the right questions, we get the right answers, because there was no doubt Moses knew his experience was real. He's not questioning that anywhere within the text. He's not saying, "Hey, by the way, is this really happening? Or am I just dreaming this?" or any of these things. He's asking very specific questions so that he can get the right answers, right? But what he was being asked to do was going to require some confidence to get this done. It's the proverbial "don't bring a knife to a gunfight" way of thinking. God has told Moses, "I am now sending you back to the same Pharaoh who was looking to kill you, who had legions of soldiers, who was the most powerful person in the world at the time. You're going to go tell him to let my people go." I'd ask some questions too, right? Some of you all feel like God's asked you to do something, but you lack the confidence to obey because you're not asking questions. You're not seeking clarity to how it could ever be accomplished, because you're relying on a limited view of who God is. And for some of you, your best explanation at this point is the big guy in the sky, God. Keep in mind, the title God is what you call ambiguous, and that's a fancy word for open for interpretation. You say God, you mean something I don't mean when I say God, right? But here we learn that no question is a stupid question. When you have a living God who makes himself known to the one who calls on his name. Last week, it was, "Who am I to do such a thing?" to which God says, "I will be with you." In other words, it doesn't matter who you are. It matters who I am. And if you remember, Jesus says the same thing later in the Great Commission as he tells the disciples to go out and change the world, Matthew 28:20. Jesus says, "And remember, I am with you always." He doesn't say, "And remember all of the verses I asked you to memorize." remember of all of the prayer time that we had, make sure you do those things. He says, remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. You're not relying on you, you'll be relying on me. In other words, I'm not concerned with who you are or maybe who you've been because I'm the one doing it all. All I need from you is to obey me. And it's a good question if you think about it. If your view is about your own worthiness or your own righteousness, but the right question should have been, who am I that you would be so kind to reveal yourself to me? Who am I that you would not only reveal yourself to me and call me to do something for you, but who am I that you could even use me? He is God, the one true God. So what's Moses do? He asks another question. Verse 13. Moses asked God, if I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, well, what is his name? What should I tell them? See, this is the question we all should be asking because we assume we know who God is. Where I would argue to think of God means that you may have a concept of who he is, which would be your mistake because the one true God has a name. And it's in the name that we find all the answers to our problems. So that everything to know about God derives from his name, and to think of him in a general sense will dictate how we live our lives and what we believe, right? Now, keep in mind, much like today's times, all the people groups in Egypt and the neighboring countries, they had gods who had names, right? We live in times now where there's Buddha and Thor and all kinds of other gods, little g, that have names, right? And so this isn't crazy to think that gods would have had names back then. It was very common in those days that you would distinguish between the little g gods. And so the God of the Hebrews, who up to this point has been nameless, will share his name with Moses. But Moses is thinking, when he's asking the question, well, what should I tell them? What if they ask me, what is his name? What Moses is thinking about, well, there are the Egyptian gods, Ra, the god of the sun, Osiris, the god of the underworld, Thoth, the god of wisdom and knowledge, not to mention that if you remember, he says, I'm taking you from Egypt and I'm sending you to the promised land, which is currently called Canaan. And in Canaan, they had gods. Molech was the god of sacrifice, usually child sacrifice, and Baal was the god of fertility. So Moses knows to put a name on it, and I'd argue we should too, right? To say God is to say a concept of the human mind outside of divine revelation that we find in the scriptures. So, a very common phrase that gets thrown around today, specifically in some of the circles I'm in, is God as you understand him. That doesn't mean that that's truly a God. It's your understanding of a God. But the Christian has the one true God, right? Well, what's his name? Verse 14. God replied to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. Now he's comparing those, he's pulling those two things together. This is my name forever. This is how I'm to be remembered in every generation. Would you guys say that every generation would include our generation? Absolutely, right? And so the Hebrew word for this is Ehyeh Asher yay. I am who I am. Better yet, think of me like this. I be. I just be. I will be. I just exist. And see, it begins to create tension in your mind, right? He just exists. He has no beginning and he has no end because he's always existed. Therefore, nothing has made him, nor can anything restrict him. You know, good illustration of this is when kids come up and they're, hey, Pastor Roger, my son's got a question for you. A lot of times it's going to be one of 5 questions, but typically it's this one. Hey, who created God? And so what that does is that demonstrates the human mind thinks that if anything exists, it must have been created, right? And so that's a good question and a healthy question. It gives you the chance to explain to them, oh, honey, nothing created God. He's always existed. God is outside of time, space, and matter, yet capable of interacting within time, space, and matter. He is present in all things. This one always blows my mind, including the past and the future. So that when he says, I am the God of Abraham, I am the God of Isaac, and I am the God of Jacob, he was the same God in all of those times and the same God then that he is to Moses now, right? He is absolute reality. There's no reality outside of God. He's totally independent of any and all things. Therefore, everything that is not God relies on or is dependent on God. He's constant, he's consistent. He never changes, and he's never swayed by any circumstances. He's never surprised by any complications. He is the absolute standard of truth, goodness, and beauty because he defined all things when he created them and he said, this is good. Therefore, a platypus would be considered beautiful because he created the platypus or the anteater and he said, this is good, right? God is free to do what pleases him at any time with anyone because he's in total control of all things. God is a spirit, invisible, immaterial, and immortal, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, in his wisdom, in his power, in his holiness, in his justice, in his goodness, and in his truth. Right now, you should start feeling really small. God is a big God. He is the I am that's always existed, right? He is the I am, and everything else is the I ain't, period. Isaiah 43:10 and 11. No God, little g, was formed for me, and there will be none after me. I, I am the Lord. Besides me, there is no other God. So let's put that into perspective. I'm a visual learner and I like to think visually because I can see it. If I can see it, I can get my arms around it. There are 8 billion people on the planet Earth, roughly, right now. Not to mention all the people before us. And yet, the Earth has not been fully discovered. Every nook, every cranny, in the ocean, in the mountains, all these places has yet to been covered by man. Now, imagine the Earth being a golf ball. Louis Gigolo does a video on this called Indescribable. It's amazing, right? But imagine the Earth being a golf ball, and you're going to find yourself standing on that golf ball, okay? That golf ball, in relation to the size of the sun, The one star within our solar system, one, you see millions when you look up there. There's only one in proximity of the Earth, and it's even millions of miles away. You could put 960,000 Earths inside of the sun, to which the star breathing God we know created. 960 golf balls can fit inside of a school bus and fill it up. And the star breathing God we know created us. He created you, and He knows you by name. If that doesn't do anything for you, think about this. That God is who we find in the Bible being a personal God, revealing Himself to Moses, meaning God is available, God is present, God is accessible, God is near to us, God is here this morning, and He's willing to forgive us, He's willing to deliver us, and He's willing to provide guidance for us on our journey this side of heaven. He is a personal God. He hears us and He sees us, and He rescues us from the things that we make God in our lives. When? We genuinely cry out for rescue. I'm not sure about you, but that brings me comfort and encourages me. And to be real honest, at times, it kind of beats my pride down because I have a tendency to think I'm far greater than what I really am. But in perspective of being 1 in 8 billion on the planet Earth, which 960,000 of them could fit in the sun, and that's just one star out of all the million stars that you see. God is far bigger, guys, than what you could ever imagine. You can't box Him in. You can't wrap your mind around it, right? It should bring you comfort, and it should encourage you to think, that's my God, the great I am. There's nothing He can't do. It literally should make you sing the song Waymaker totally different. He's a waymaker, miracle worker, and a promise keeper. Do you know why He is? Because He can be. That's why. Because He can be. And just because I realize some of you are familiar with the other names of God, like there's all kinds of names of God studies that get passed around, I want you to understand each of the many names of God describes a different aspect of His many faceted character, so that those names are descriptions of His character. That's what those are. They're just names of the descriptions of His character. In most cases, they're encounters between the people in the Old Testament where God has revealed Himself in some capacity, some form, or some fashion, that the person then gives Him a descriptive name. But all these names derive from who He is or as a result of His being. And so some of those names, quickly, I'll just give you 3 of them. El Roi, that is the God who sees me. El Shaddai is God Almighty. El Olam is the everlasting God. Jehovah Jireh is the God who provides, right? Those are names that are describing who He is. It's not His name. And I share that because those are names we use to describe Him, but His name is I Am. And that's important because when Jesus is dealing with people in the gospel, He doesn't list all those names. He simply says, I am. I am. I am the resurrection. I am the good shepherd. I am the bread of life, which indicates He is the same God, not the names of God. More specifically, He's the second person of the Godhead, Yahweh. He is God in the flesh, right? So verse 15, He says, now go tell your people, because they know me. They know the God of the Hebrews. They know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Go tell me, go tell them that I'm the one that sent you, and I'm going to provide a home, and Egypt is not your home. So buckle up, because we're about to take a ride. But don't worry about what you're going to do, because I'm going to take care of all of it. All you need to know is my name and remember it forever. Yahweh. It's listed 6,800 times in the Old Testament. And Yahweh, it's translated into English. Y'all about to learn some Bible stuff. You can go show off in front of somebody. You ready? It's translated into capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. So that when you're reading your Bible and you see Lord in all capitals, that's the word Yahweh. YHWH. Not to be confused with the Lord that's being used in this text this morning. Because Lord, like God, is a title. And Lord is a title for master. But Lord, capitalized, is the name of our God. When you know that, what comes after that shouldn't be a problem. Verse 16 to 22. I won't read necessarily all of it, but go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, your master, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he's appeared to me and said, I've paid close attention to you and what's been done to you in Egypt, and I've promised you that I'll bring you up from the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites and the rest of the fellows, a land flowing with milk and honey. They will listen to what you say. Then you, along with the elders of Israel, then you must go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. See, it doesn't say a God, it clearly says the God of the Hebrews. Now, please let us go on a 3-day trip into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. However, I know, why? Because he knows all things, that the king of Egypt will not allow you to go, even under a force from a strong hand. But when I stretch out my hand and I strike Egypt with all my miracles that I'll perform in it, after that, he'll let you go. And I'll give these people such favor with the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. We'll save the rest for a later date. We'll come back to it. Now, here's what we know and we can agree on. Names have meaning. Names have meaning. And we know that because some of y'all like to name drop, right? See, you lighthouse guys, like you'll show up, you'll be like, Shauna said I could do this. And I'm like, I don't care what Shauna said. This is church, homeboy. Like, this ain't the life, right? But, or you'll come in here and you'll be like, hey, Roger said that, and it's like, that's what we do. We'll name drop because it might afford us some privileges. So I say that to say this isn't unfamiliar to us. And it's why God takes the time to reveal his name to Moses. You go tell them I sent you, and they'll listen to you because my people know me. And when you drop my name, they'll know the power and authority that comes with my name. And personally, I think this is interesting, and it's something for us to really reflect on, right? And I say that because of this. Think about the situation. The situation is that they're enslaved, they're being oppressed, they're being mistreated, they're being taken advantage of, and they're just being treated horribly as slaves to the Egyptians. And so we could assume, right? I don't think this is a far stretch. They had to feel as if they have no dignity. They had to get up every day just totally defeated, discouraged, and really disgraced as a slave. And God tells Moses, go mention my name and don't ever forget its meaning. So he tells him, go tell him. Why? Because God's people should know who he is so that when we find ourselves in similar moments of difficulties and dark places, we're to remember his name because that tells us who he is. Not just God. This is the great I am. Now, that's contrary to what the church does today. And I'm going to explain that. What we have a tendency to do is we'll offer truths that aren't rooted in his name when it's his name that has power, right? See, the same God of Abraham is our God. The same God of Moses in this story right now is our God. But here's what we do. We'll offer some little encouraging, even sometimes verses, right? So there's a friend struggling, having a hard time. We're like, oh, brother, he knows the plans he has for you, plans for a hope and plans for a future. Or, hey, you got to remember all things work together for the good. Or, hey, just remember Jesus said he's overcome the world. And we don't get much, and we wonder why those seem to fall on their face to the one with a recent cancer diagnosis. All things work together for the good, right? Or somebody who wakes up to their spouse leaving them, or somebody who's the breadwinner of the family losing the job or being laid off, the main provider of the home. Very difficult, real things we all encounter where the verse that's meant to be helpful just isn't helpful. Specifically for those that don't know God to begin with, and we're giving them a verse, right? But for the Christian, I think it's because, at least it has been in my life, it's in those moments where we lose sight of who we know God to be because our circumstances and our situations seem to be greater than the God we worship. And it's not until we're reminded of or we remember his name, which tells us not only who he is, but how big he is, we can realize nothing is impossible with the one true and only God, Yahweh. Amen? It says, those who know my name, they know me. They'll listen to me. But those who don't know me don't know my name, and they won't listen to you. And so Pharaoh essentially is a picture of all those who are outside of Christ. They're the unbeliever, right? The unbeliever's hard-hearted, the unbeliever's stubborn, they're prideful, and they're unwilling to bow down to the one true God. And that's the only place his name makes no difference. And the reason is they know of a God, but they don't have the right name until God shows him his power by way of power and miracles that are unfathomable from any man-made God. That will force him to let his people go. And so here's the mistake that we make, right? Moses, he's seeing through his own eyes. And I want you to hear me say this and I want you to really visualize this. We're almost done. Every time Moses is asking a question, God is responding something. He really don't answer his question every time because he recognizes Moses is seeing through his own eyes. And so every time God responds, it's like God continues just to lift his chin up so that he can see who it was calling him to such an overwhelming task. And what we are able to do for God is never about who we are, but who we know. I know who I am today because I know who he is. And it's not just a God, it is the living God. So that whatever we're able to do for God is never about who we are, but who we know. The name above all names, Lord, or Yahweh, the great I am, who was and is to come. All that to say, I know who I am today in Christ, even though when God revealed himself to me, I said, well, who am I to do anything you're asking me to do? Today, my answer is simply, I am the great I ain't, who comes in the name of the Lord. Yahweh, to be exact. Therefore, I have total confidence. I am has sent me to you this morning to tell you this. Exodus 34:6. The Lord is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin. And so I'm going to be blunt with y'all, some of y'all this morning. You've had the wrong name. therefore calling on the wrong God. God has not failed you. You had a concept, you had a human understanding of who He was. And although some people will never forgive you for calling them by the wrong name, God does. God knows that you was calling on the wrong God. He desires to know you, and He desires that you know Him. And He's here this morning with open arms to receive you just the way you are. For others, we've forgotten who He was. We've allowed circumstances and situations to overwhelm us. We've drifted from the one who rescued us. But this morning, He's reminding you, come on home. Come on home. I am the great I am. I forgive sins for thousands of generations. Don't ever forget my name. It's from my name derives all the characteristics and qualities that I might have. And one of them that's most important this morning is that God loves you just for who you are, and He desires to know you, and He desires for you to call out on Him, and He desires to rescue you. You know why? Because it glorifies God. It gives glory to His name. He wants to rescue the one person sitting in here this morning that's convinced that God could never do anything for them. He wants them to jump up and run down and say, glory be to God. I thought that He would never come and save me, but here I am today, trusting in the work that God has done on the cross for all of us. Let's worship.